1. Turn winding knob in the direction indicated by the arrow until it comes to a stop. This operation simultaneously winds the shutter and advances the film for the next exposure. Double exposures are thus prevented. 2. The exposure counter automatically registers the number of exposures made, provided it was set to 0 when the new film was inserted. Note, the dial may be turned in an anti-wise direction, independently of the knob. 3. Shutter release. Press the button gently and firmly, avoiding any jerking movement. Use the index finger of the right hand when the camera is held horizontally, or the right thumb when a vertical picture is being made. A cable release may be screwed over the release button when required. 4. The film type indicator on the winding knob is set to the type and speed of film used, and a new adjustment made whenever the camera is loaded with different negative material. Film speeds are shown in LEICA and Western exposure index numbers. To set the film type indicator, lift the milled edge of the winding knob. For black and white film, turn it in the direction of the engraved arrow and let it drop into place at the correct setting. The lettering will then be in while on black. For color film, lift the milled edge and turn as far as required against the direction of the arrow. The letters LEICA and Western are then in white on red, which shows that the camera is loaded with color film. The speed figure itself is always white on black. 5. Fast shutter speed dial. The engraved figures are the denominators of the fractions of a second they represent. For example, 60 indicate 1/60 sec. 1000 signifies 1/1000 sec. And so on. The speed is set after winding the shutter by raising the dial and turning it until the desired figure falls opposite the arrow. It is then allowed to spring back into its seating. When set to B, the shutter remains open as long as pressure on the release button is maintained. When the shutter is rewound, is maintained. When the shutter is rewound, the dial returns to the position occupied before release. The dial need not, therefore, be adjusted unless a different speed is required. When exposures longer than 1/50 sec are required, the slow shutter speed dial is brought into play as indicated overleaf. 6. Slow shutter speed dial. Before setting this dial, the top dial of the LEICA Ⅲ must be set to the red index 30. This is most important. The figures on the slow speed dial can be read from above and provide for exposures of 1/20, 1/15, 1/4, 1/4 and 1 sec. And time. This range also covers speeds intermediate between those marked, thus, set halfway between 1/4 and 1 sec. The shutter yields an exposure of 3 for sec. Intermediate speeds are not possible in the faster exposure range. When the slow speed dial is set to T, the shutter opens on being released and remains open until the slow speed dial is turned back a little. A safety catch retains the slow speed dial at E30 position. This catch is released by the thumbnail when slower speeds are required. (7) Iris diaphragm adjustment. The human eye is able to adapt itself to varying intensities of light by dilation or contraction of the pupil. The lower the light intensity, the wider the pupil becomes, and vice versa. The pupil of the photographic lens is enlarged or reduced by means of an iris diaphragm. The light passing value of a lens is governed by the ratio of its focal length to the diameter of the pupil, and is usually referred to as the aperture or stop. The numerical value of the stop is stated either as a ratio, thus 1:3.5 or commonly 3.5. A lens of this value has a focal length 3.5 times as large as the diameter of the pupil. Theoretically, all lenses having the same f number pass the same amount of light for the purpose of exposure. It is customary to graduate the aperture scale on photographic lenses so that the values vary in a 2:1 ratio. Thus, stopping down one division demands a doubling of exposure time, other conditions being equal. The relation between aperture value and exposure time shows in the table. 8. Focusing the lens. At 1950, all LEICA lenses having a focusing lever are automatically locked at the infinity position. To release the lever for focusing on near subjects, press the knob of the end of the lever. 9. Distance scale. Normally, actual distances do not interest LEICA photographers as focusing is affected by the Rajnephysite. The distance scale, therefore, is of importance only when referring to the depth of field scale described on page 15. Depth of field scale. An object is most sharply defined in a photograph when it lies at the distance on which the lens is focused. Definition would gradually deteriorate if the object were moved nearer the camera until a point would be reached when definition would be quite unsatisfactory. Similarly, definition would deteriorate, although not so rapidly, if the object were moved away from the camera. The distance between the nearest plane and the furthest plane at which objects are sufficiently sharply defined is known as the depth of field. It varies with the distance focused upon and the aperture of the lens. The nearer the principal object and the larger the stop of the lens, the shallower the depth of field, and therefore the more critical must focusing be. A scale on LEICA lens mounts enables the depth of field to be read at each aperture and each distance, setting down to 3.5 feet. Objects at distances between those indicated on the scale will be sufficiently sharply defined. Twin eyepiece. This carries the eyepieces of both viewfinder and Rajnephysite so that only a slight movement of the head is necessary when changing from one to the other. Viewfinder. The built-in viewfinder indicates the view embraced by the standard 50 mm lenses. When lenses of other focal lengths are in use, the universal viewfinder, which fits into the accessory shoe, must be brought into use. The viewfinder of the LEICA Ⅲ is of the reflecting type and can be used to good advantage on models EF and EWF. 13. Coupled Rajnephysite. In miniature photography, accurate focusing is essential for perfect definition and sharp enlargements. Former visual examination under the black cloth is now replaced by the movement of a single finger. The Rajnephysite coupled with the LEICA lens measures the distance and at the same time focuses the lens accurately on that distance. Focusing is effected by means of the lens focusing lever. When the lens is set at infinity, near objects appear to be double when viewed through the Rajnephysite. When the lever is operated so that the two images of an object coincide, the lens is focused on that object. All interchangeable LEICA lenses up to 13.5 cm focal length are automatically coupled with the Rajnephysite when screwed into the camera body. Adjustment of Rajnephysite telescope. The accuracy of the LEICA Rajnephysite is augmented by a built-in telescope having a magnification of 1.5. By means of the small lever it may be focused on distant objects. It will also compensate for slight eyesight defects. Hammer drill. 1. Remove lens cap. 2. Withdraw lens and lock it by turning clockwise to that stop. 3. Turn winding knob to the stop. 4. Adjust lens aperture. 5. Set shutter speed dial. 6. Compose picture in viewfinder. 7. Focus lens by means of the magnifier. 8. Gently press release button. To load the LEICA ⅲ. Before inserting a new film cassette, set reversing lever to a. Wind and release the shutter to make sure that it is in order. Wind the shutter again but do not release it. 2. Open the camera by raising the locking handle on the base plate and turning to open and lift the base plate. 3. Remove the take-up spool from the camera. 4. Place the LEICA on the table as shown in the illustration. 5. Hold the take-up spool in the left hand and the loaded film cassette in the right. Both knurled heads should point downwards. Insert trimmed end of the film under the clamping spring of take-up spool as far as it will go. The perforated edge of the film should above the spool flange. 6. Draw the trimmed leader strip from the film cassette slot until two perforations on the trimmed edge of the film are visible. The curved mark on the outer shell of the LEICA cassette indicates the correct position of the film. 7. Introduce the take-up spool and film cassette into camera simultaneously, knurled heads pointing upwards. The trimmed film will then enter the slot along the back of the camera. If the cassette will not drop right down, turn the rewinding knob slightly. 8. Hook the base plate over the pen, close it and turn the locking handle to close. The camera is now light tight. 9. Turn the rewind knob carefully in direction indicated by the arrow until a slight resistance is felt. This will tighten the leader strip. Press the release button and turn winding knob once again. 10. Turn exposure counter anti-close to 0, release shutter and again turn the winding knob. While the winding knob rotates clockwise, the rewind knob should turn in the opposite direction to the arrow, viz. Anti-close. This will indicate that the film is traveling properly. The exposure counter will now be pointing to 1 and the LEICA is ready for use. Unloading the LEICA. When the full length of film has been exposed, it will be impossible to turn the winding knob without exerting the film into the cassette. Before doing so, verify that the slow speed dial is not set to T or the shutter might be open and the film would be exposed while being reworn. To be doubly sure, fit the lens cap while rewinding. 1. To unload the camera, set the reversing lever to R. This disengages the automatic coupling of the film transport and the shutter mechanism. 2. Pull up the rewind knob and turn in the direction of the arrow until resistance is felt. This will indicate that the film has been unwound from the take-up spool and is being held merely by its tip under the spring of the spool. Wind to overcome resistance, and after to completely rewind into the cassette. 3. After rewinding the film, the base plate may be removed and the cassette withdrawn. Protect loaded cassettes from dust and light by storing in the original light metal containers.